Springtime A La Carte by O. Henry. Coffee Break Collection 31, Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. Springtime A La Carte. It was a day in March. Never begin a story this way when you write one. No opening could possibly be worse. It is unimaginative, flat, dry, and likely to consist of mere wind. But in this instance it is allowable, for the following paragraph, which should have inaugurated the narrative, is too wildly extravagant and preposterous to be flaunted in the face of the reader without preparation. Sarah was crying over her bill of fare. Think of a New York girl shedding tears on the menu card. To account for this, you will be allowed to guess that the lobsters were all out, or that she had sworn ice cream off during Lent, or that she had ordered onions, or that she had just come from a Hackett matinee. And then, all these theories being wrong, you will please let the story proceed. The gentleman who announced that the world was an oyster which he, with his sword, would open, made a larger hit than he deserved. It is not difficult to open an oyster with a sword. But did you ever notice anyone trying the terrestrial bivalve with a typewriter? Like to wait for a dozen raw opened that way? Sarah had managed to pry apart the shells with her unhandy weapon far enough to nibble a wee bit at the cold and clammy world within. She knew no more shorthand than if she had been a graduate in stenography just let slip upon the world by a business college. So, not being able to stenog, she would not enter that bright galaxy of office talent. She was a freelance typewriter and canvassed for odd jobs of copying. The most brilliant and crowning feat of Sarah's battle with the world was the deal she made with Schulenburg's home restaurant. The restaurant was next door to the old red brick in which she hall-roomed. One evening, after dinner at Schulenburg's 40-cent 5-course table d'hôte, served as fast as you can throw the 5 baseballs at the colored gentleman's head, Sarah took away with her the bill of fare. It was written in an almost unreadable script, neither in English nor German, and so arranged that if you are not careful, you begin with a toothpick and rice pudding, and ended with soup and the day of the week. The next day, Sarah showed Schulenburg a neat card on which the menu was beautifully typewritten, with the viands temptingly marshaled under their right and proper heads, from hors d'oeuvres to not responsible for overcoats and umbrellas. Schulenburg became a naturalized citizen on the spot. Before Sarah left him, she had him willingly committed to an agreement. She was to furnish typewritten bills of fare for the 21 tables in the restaurant, a new bill for each day's dinner, and new ones for breakfast and lunch as often as changes occurred in the food or as neatness required. In return for this, Schulenburg was to send 3 meals per diem to Sarah's hall room by a waiter, an obsequious one if possible, and furnish her each afternoon with a pencil draft of what fate had in store for Schulenburg's customers on the morrow. Mutual satisfaction resulted from the agreement. Schulenburg's patrons now knew what the food they ate was called, even if its nature sometimes puzzled them. And Sarah had food during a cold, dull winter, which was the main thing for her. And then the almanac lied and said that spring had come. Spring comes when it comes. The frozen snows of January still lay like adamant in the crosstown streets. The hand organs still played in the good old summer time with their December vivacity and expression. Men began to make 30-day notes to buy Easter dresses. Janitors shut off steam, and when these things happen, one may know that the city is still in the clutches of winter. One afternoon, Sarah shivered in her elegant hall bedroom. Quote, house heated, scrupulously clean, conveniences seen to be appreciated. Close quote. She had no work to do except Schulenberg's menu cards. Sarah sat in her squeaky willow rocker and looked out the window. The calendar on the wall kept crying to her, springtime is here, Sarah. Springtime is here, I tell you. Look at me, Sarah. Sarah, my figures show it. You've got a neat figure yourself, Sarah. A nice springtime figure. Why do you look out the window so sadly? Sarah's room was at the back of the house. Looking out the window, she could see the windowless rear brick wall of the box factory on the next street. But the wall was clearest crystal, and Sarah was looking down a grassy lane shaded with cherry trees and elms and bordered with raspberry bushes and Cherokee roses. Spring's real harbingers are too subtle for the eye and ear. Some must have the flowering crocus, the wood-starring dogwood, the voice of the bluebird, even so gross a reminder as the farewell handshake of the retiring buckwheat and oyster before they can welcome the lady in green to their dull bosoms. But to old Earth's choicest kin there come straight, sweet messages from his newest bride, telling them they shall be no stepchildren unless they choose to be. On the previous summer, Sarah had gone into the country and loved a farmer. In writing your story, never hark back thus. It is bad art, and cripples interest. Let it march, march. Sarah stayed 2 weeks at Sunnybrook Farm, and there she learned to love old Farmer Franklin's son, Walter. Farmers have been loved and wedded and turned out to grass in less time. But young Walter Franklin was a modern agriculturist. He had a telephone in his cow house, and he could figure up exactly what effect next year's Canada wheat crop would have on potatoes planted in the dark of the moon. It was in this shaded and raspberried lane that Walter had wooed and won her, and together they had set and woven a crown of dandelions for her hair. He had immoderately praised the effect of the yellow blossom against her brown tresses, and she had left the chaplet there and walked back to the house swinging her straw sailor in her hands. They were to marry in the spring. At the very first signs of spring, Walter said, and Sarah came back to the city to pound her typewriter. A knock at the door dispelled Sarah's visions of that happy day. A waiter had brought the rough pencil draft of the home restaurant's next day fare in old Schulenberg's angular hand. Sarah sat down to her typewriter and slipped a card between the rollers. She was a nimble worker. Generally, in an hour and a half, the 21 menu cards were written and ready. Today, there were more changes on the bill of fare than usual. The soups were lighter, pork was eliminated from the entrees, figuring only with Russian turnips among the roasts. The gracious spirit of spring pervaded the entire menu. Lamb, that lately capered on the greening hillsides, was becoming exploited with the sauce that commemorated its gambols. The song of the oyster, though not silenced, was diminuendo con amore. The frying pan seemed to be held inactive behind the beneficent bars of the broiler. The pie list swelled. The richer puddings had vanished. The sausage, with his drapery wrapped about him, barely lingered in a pleasant thanatopsis with the buckwheats and the sweet but doomed maple. Sarah's fingers danced like midgets above a summer stream. Down through the courses she worked, giving each item its position according to its length with an accurate eye. Just above the desserts came the list of vegetables: carrots and peas, asparagus on toast, the perennial tomatoes and corn and succotash, lima beans, cabbage, and then Sarah was crying over her bill of fare. Tears from the depths of some divine despair rose in her heart and gathered to her eyes. Down went her head on the little typewriter stand, and the keyboard rattled a dry accompaniment to her moist sobs. For she had received no letter from Walter in 2 weeks, and the next item on the bill of fare was dandelions. Dandelions with some kind of egg. But bother the egg. Dandelions, with whose golden blooms Walter had crowned her his queen of love and future bride. Dandelions, the harbingers of spring, her sorrow's crown of sorrow, reminder of her happiest days. Madam, I dare you to smile until you suffer this test. Let the Maréchal Niel roses that Percy brought you on the night you gave him your heart be served as a salad with French dressing before your eyes at a Schulenburg table d'hôte. Had Juliet so seen her love tokens dishonored, the sooner would she have sought the Lethean herbs of the good apothecary. But what a witch is spring! Into the great cold city of stone and iron a message had to be sent. There was none to convey it but the little hardy courier of the fields, with his rough green coat and modest air. He is a true soldier of fortune, this Dent de Lion, this lion's tooth, as the French chefs call him. Flowered he will assist at love-making, wreathed in my lady's nut-brown hair. Young and callow and unblossomed, he goes into the boiling pot and delivers the word of his sovereign mistress. By and by, Sarah forced back her tears. The cards must be written, but still, in a faint golden glow from her dandelion dreams, she fingered the typewriter keys absently for a while, with her mind and heart in the meadow lane with her young farmer. But soon she came swiftly back to the rock-bound lanes of Manhattan, and the typewriter began to rattle and jump like a strike-breaker's motor car. At 6 o'clock, the waiter brought her dinner and carried away the typewritten bill of fare. When Sarah ate, she set aside, with a sigh, the dish of dandelions with its crowning ovarious accompaniment. As this dark mass had been transformed from a bright and love-endorsed flower to be an ignominious vegetable, so had her summer hopes wilted and perished. Love may, as Shakespeare said, feed on itself, but Sarah could not bring herself to eat the dandelions that had graced as ornaments the first spiritual banquet of her heart's true affection. At 7:30, the couple in the next room began to quarrel. The man in the room above sought for an A on his flute. The gas went a little lower. 3 coal wagons started to unload, the only sound of which the phonograph is jealous. Cats on the back fences slowly retreated toward Mukden, and by these signs Sarah knew that it was time for her to read. She got out The Cloister and the Hearth, the best non-selling book of the month, settled her feet on her trunk, and began to wander with Gerard. The front doorbell rang. The landlady answered it. Sarah left Gerard and Denise to read by a bear and listened. Oh, yes, you would, just as she did. Then a strong voice was heard in the hall below, and Sarah jumped for her door, leaving the book on the floor, and the first round easily the bear's. You've guessed it. She reached the top of the stairs just as her farmer came up 3 at a jump, and reaped and garnered her, with nothing left for the gleaners. Why haven't you written? Oh, why? Cried Sarah. New York is a pretty large town, said Walter Franklin. I came in a week ago to your old address. I found that you went away on a Thursday. That consoled some. It eliminated the possible Friday bad luck, but it didn't prevent my hunting for you with police and otherwise ever since. I wrote, said Sarah vehemently. Never got it. Then how did you find me? And the young farmer smiled a springtime smile. I dropped into that home restaurant next door this evening, said he. I don't care who knows it. I like a dish of some kind of greens at this time of year. I ran my eye down that nice typewritten bill of fare, looking for something in that line. When I got below cabbage, I turned my chair over and hollered for the proprietor. He told me where you lived. I remember, sighed Sarah happily. That was dandelions below cabbage. I'd know that cranky capital W way above the line that your typewriter makes anywhere in the world, said Franklin. Why, there's no W in dandelions, said Sarah in surprise. The young man drew the bill of fare from his pocket and pointed to a line. Sarah recognized the first card she had typewritten that afternoon. There was still the rayed splotch in the upper right-hand corner where a tear had fallen, but over the spot where one should have read the name of the meadow plant, the clinging memory of their golden blossoms had allowed her fingers to strike strange keys. Between the red cabbage and the stuffed green peppers was the item. Dearest Walter, with hard-boiled egg. End of Springtime A La Carte.
In April, by Emmanuel Geibel, translated by Carter Freiligrott Croker. Coffee Break Collection 31, Springtime. In April. Oh, humid eve of April, how dear to me you are! The sky is all cloud-curtained, with here and there a star. Like breath of love so balmy, the air blows warm and wet. From out the valley rises faint scent of violet. I fain a song would utter that like this eve shall be, and cannot find so dreamy, so soft a melody. End of In April. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Have a wonderful spring.
The April Moment by Marion Storm. Coffee Break Collection 31, Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. The April Moment. Chapter 4. Survivor of so much that her fear is gone, triumphant April answers the dark powers as if they could never speak again. Spring after spring, she stands among flying petals and smiles at the last bitter winds. She will not grant that the green earth was ever vanquished, fiercely alive as it now is. Scornfully the new silver bloom on the clover sheds the relentless rain. Undaunted, reaffirming, she summons all beauty of color, music, and fragrance beneath her banners, with a vitality so profound and impregnable that more than other months she is careless of man's sympathy. April, preoccupied, hastens from crumbling furrow to meadows that shout the coming of the green. Intense and too eager for tenderness, she craves no admiration. Quite without excuse, the song sparrow sits on a wine-colored willow twig and sings frantically. Anyone has as good a reason for ecstasy as he, merely that the dumb struggle is ended and the long suns have returned in splendor. Contemplative between their dark exotic leaves, dog-tooth violets fill the light-flecked hollows. Spring beauties open warily at daybreak to show stamens of deep rose. Where imperious amber waters go foaming through the swamp, spendthrift gold of cowslips is swept down to the rivers, and budded branches that lean too close above the ripple are shut out from the sun world for a while. Mauve and canary slivers are waiting for the fairy queen, where our wild orchid of the north dangles them on remote knolls, but they are usually found and borne off by someone for whom they are in no way suitable. Translucent young leaves glitter beside the stream's path. Dandelion rosettes appear with serene impartiality on guarded lawn and mountain pasture, where steal also the polite but persistent pussy tiptoes, asserting the right to display white leaves in spring, if so a plant should choose. The snail has deserted his shell and gone forth to take the air at the risk of being plowed under. None of April's children remember or foresee. The vivid present is enough. The apple boughs are inlaid with coral, the peach is a cloud of dawn, and petals of the forward cherry and pear are floating reluctantly down. Wild fruit trees, mysteriously planted, are misty white above the woodland thicket, scented crabapple and twisted branch of plum. This is the month of blossoms, as May is the month of shimmering leaves, and June of the fruitless flower. The blackbird swings at the foamy crest of the haw, disturbed by 1,000 delights, and notes too few to tell them. The crow hoarsely mentions his rapture as he flaps above the moving harrow, and the new lambs look on in a tremulous, wounded manner, while the famished woodchuck makes away with the clover heads they were just about to endeavor to bite off. Uncertainly, the wondering calves proceed about the pasture, not yet at the stage in life where they will skip with touching curiosity after every object that stirs. At dusk and glistening morning, there are bird songs such as only April hears, the outburst of welcome to the light, and the sleepy fluting of the robins when the sky turns to a soft prism in the west. Fainter, more melancholy even than in March, is the twilight lament of the peepers. They are alien to the aria of April. New England's forget-me-nots are fleet turquoise in the grasses. New England's arbutus flowers lie flushed pearls among the ancient leaves. But everywhere are the violets of 3 colors, yellow for the pool's edge, white among the boglands, and blue as pervasive as the sunlight on hill slope, road bank, and forest floor. And there are the violets of an unfathomable blue, sprinkled with white like wisps of cloud against far mountains. Some grow close to the earth, taught by past dismay. Others, long-stemmed and sweet, will live and suffer and mend their ways next year. The windflower meets the breeze, a slim princess, incredibly fragile, yet broken less easily than the strong tulip, vaguely touched with rose or white as bloodroot. Tulips dwell not only on the ground. They have parted great opaque petals at the tops of trees, starting to see in the leafless wood. Watercress glitters in the cold streams where trout, winter-weary, are on patrol for those flies now magnificent in their jeweled dress of spring. The first oak leaves are delicately crimson at the end of the bough. Disregard, amid this pageantry of La Vita Nuova, the outrageous satire of brown skeleton fingers that point stiffly up through the shining blades of grass. If they seem to be a chilling cynicism of nature, who has not found an April dandelion telling a braver story through winter snow? Cedar and balsam twig are golden-tipped. Nothing is unchanged. immortal wings that beat through February gales to reach this land of their tradition, are fluttering now about the building of the nest. The smooth chimney swift flashes above the barn and is gone. With drooping wings he hangs poised against the daffodil sky in his evening play. Peaceably among the lilacs the contented bluebird sits, though through bulb, root, and chrysalis has passed the irresistible current that will let no share of the earth be still, not stone, nor sea, nor man. Into this forced march April steps with gladness, hailing the order predestined to change. Joining her unresisting, take for your own the moment of escape which the singer in the blossoms freely claims. Life's fullness is measured by these salvaged April moments, when suddenly joy becomes a simple and close-dwelling thing, when for a merciful, lighted instant the impersonal and endless beauty of the world seems enough. End of The April Moment.
Autumn and Spring by Frank Rinder. Coffee Break Collection 31. Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by TallyTiger. Autumn and Spring. A fair maiden lay asleep in a rice field. The sun was at his height, and she was weary. Now a god looked down upon the rice field. He knew that the beauty of the maiden came from within, that it mirrored the beauty of heaven's dreams. He knew that even now, as she smiled, she held converse with the spirit of the wind or the flowers. The god descended and asked the dream maiden to be his bride. She rejoiced, and they were wed. A wonderful red jewel came of their happiness. Long, long afterwards, the stone was found by a farmer, who saw that it was a very rare jewel. He prized it highly, and he always carried it about with him. Sometimes, as he looked in it in the pale light of the moon, it seemed to him that he could discern two sparkling eyes in its depth. Again, in the stillness of the night, he would awaken and think that a clear, soft voice called him by name. One day, the farmer had to carry the midday meal to his workers in the field. The sun was very hot, so he loaded a cow with the balls of rice, the millet dumplings, and the beans. Suddenly, Prince Amaboko stood in the path. He was angry, for he thought that the farmer was about to kill the cow. The prince would hear no word of denial. His wrath increased. The farmer became more and more terrified, and finally took the precious stone from his pocket and presented it as a peace offering to the powerful prince. Amaboko marveled at the brilliancy of the jewel and allowed the man to continue his journey. The prince returned to his home. He drew forth the treasure, and it was immediately transformed into a goddess of surpassing beauty. Even as she rose before him, he loved her, and ere the moon waned, they were wed. The goddess ministered to his every want. She prepared delicate dishes, the secret of which is known only to the gods. She made wine from the juice of a myriad herbs, wine such as mortals never taste. But after a time the prince became proud and overbearing. He began to treat his faithful wife with cruel contempt. The goddess was sad and said, "You are not worthy of my love. I will leave you and go to my father." Amaboko paid no heed to these words, for he did not believe that the threat would be fulfilled. But the beautiful goddess was in earnest. She escaped from the palace and fled to Naniwa, where she was still honored as Akaru Hime, the goddess of the light. Now the prince was wroth when he heard that the goddess had left him, and set out in pursuit of her. But when he neared Naniwa, the gods would not allow his vessel to enter the haven. Then he knew that his priceless red jewel was lost to him forever. He steered his ship toward the north coast of Japan and landed at Tajima, where he was well received and highly esteemed on account of the treasures which he had brought with him. He had costly strings of pearls, girdles of precious stones, and a mirror which the wind and the waves obeyed. Prince Amaboko remained at Tajima and was the father of a mighty race. Among his children's children was a princess so renowned for her beauty that 80 suitors sought her hand. One after the other returned sorrowfully home, for none found favor in her eyes. At last 2 brothers came before her, the young god of autumn and the young god of the spring. The eldest of the 2, the god of autumn, first urged his suit, but the princess refused him. He went to his younger brother and said, "The princess does not love me, neither will you be able to win her heart." But the spring god was full of hope and replied, "I will give you a cask of rice wine if I do not win her. But if she consents to be my bride, you shall give a cask of sake to me." Now the god of spring went to his mother and told her all. She promised to aid him. Thereupon she wove in a single night a robe and sandals from the unopened buds of the lilac and the white wisteria. Out of the same delicate flowers she fashioned a bow and arrows. Thus clad, the god of spring made his way to the beautiful princess. As he stepped before the maiden, every bud unfolded, and from the heart of each blossom became a fragrance that filled the air. The princess was overjoyed and gave her hand to the god of spring. The elder brother, the god of autumn, was filled with rage when he heard how his brother had obtained the wondrous robe. He refused to give the promised cask of sake. When the mother learned that the god had broken his word, she placed stones and salt in the hollow of a bamboo cane, wrapped it around with bamboo leaves, and hung it in the smoke. Then she uttered a curse upon her firstborn son. "As the leaves wither and fade, so must you. As the salt sea ebbs, so must you. As the stones sink, so must you." The terrible curse fell upon her son, while the god of spring remained forever young, ever fragrant, ever full of mirth. The god of autumn is old and withered and sad. End of Autumn and Spring, recorded by TallyTiger.
The Blind Girl and the Spring by Sidney Gray. Coffee Break Collection 31. Springtime. The Blind Girl and the Spring. Yes, it is true that I am blind. It was not always thus, but oft it comes into my mind how God can comfort us. For if, of some good gift bereft, we bend before His will, He ever has a blessing left which should our sorrows still. This very morn I found it so. Scarce had the day begun, ere with small, pattering, restless feet that hither swiftly run, the children came in joyous mood, and shouted, "Spring is here!" And when they led me through the wood, I knew that she was near. I felt her breath upon my cheek, and while we walked along, 1,000 times I heard her speak the rustling leaves among, in tones as though a harp had thrilled beneath an angel's touch, and all my soul with rapture filled. Yet when I said as much, the others laughed and whispered low, "Nay, nay, it is the wind." To them perhaps it might be so, but, if folks are blind, they learn in every sound that floats around their pathway dark, the breeze, the brook, the glad bird notes, some hidden voice to mark. Therefore, When spring begins to don her garments fresh and gay, because I cannot look upon her beauty day by day, nor see the pointed crocus flame above the garden mould, nor watch the snowy tips that frame the daisy's heart of gold, because unto my longing eyes may never be displayed the changeful glory of the sky's warm shine and soothing shade, nor the great sun's far-reaching rays which crown the day with light, nor yet the star-lit purple haze that comes before the night, she breathes the tender tale to me in accents clear and plain, until I nearly rend the veil and see it all again. And though I'm blind, I know quite well, when to the woods we go, the place to find the wild bluebell, and where the lilies blow. Shy violets tell me, as I pass, their buds are at my feet, and through the lengthening meadow grass run murmurs soft and sweet. Oh, I thank God that He doth bring such daily joy to me, for even I can welcome spring like happy girls who see. End of The Blind Girl and the Spring. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Daffodils by William Wordsworth, followed by an excerpt from his sister Dorothy's journal, written in April 1882. Coffee Break Collection 31, Springtime. This recording is by Michele, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in March 2021. Daffodils. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. And now an excerpt from Dorothy Wordsworth's journal in April 1802, when they were walking in the woods and saw the scene that inspired this poem. When we were in the woods beyond Go Barrow Park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. We fancied that the sea had floated the seeds ashore, and that the little colony had so sprung up. But as we went along, there were more and yet more, and at last under the boughs of the trees we saw that there was a long belt of them along the shore, about the breadth of a country turnpike road. I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about and above them, and rested their heads upon these stones as on a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and reeled and danced, and seemed as if they were verily laughing with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever dancing, ever changing. This wind blew directly over the lake to them. There was here and there a little knot and a few stragglers higher up, but they were so few as not to disturb the simplicity, unity, and life of that one busy highway. We rested again and again. End of Daffodils by William Wordsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the Spring by Guy de Maupassant. Coffee Break Collection 31, Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording, All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in March 2021. In the Spring. With the first day of spring, when the awakening earth puts on its garment of green, and the warm, fragrant air fans our faces and fills our lungs, and appears even to penetrate to our hearts, we experience a vague, undefined longing for freedom, for happiness, a desire to run, to wander aimlessly, to breathe in the spring. The previous winter having been unusually severe, this spring feeling was like a form of intoxication in May, as if there were an overabundant supply of sap. One morning on waking, I saw from my window the blue sky glowing in the sun above the neighboring houses. The canaries hanging in the windows were singing loudly, and so were the servants on every floor. A cheerful noise rose up from the streets, and I went out, my spirits as bright as the day. To go, I did not exactly know where. Everybody I met seemed to be smiling. An air of happiness appeared to pervade everything in the warm light of returning spring. One might almost have said that a breeze of love was blowing through the city, and the sight of the young women whom I saw in the streets in their morning toilets, in the depths of whose eyes there lurked a hidden tenderness, and who walked with a languid grace, filled my heart with agitation. Without knowing how or why, I found myself on the banks of the Seine. Steamboats were starting for Suresnes, and suddenly I was seized by an unconquerable desire to take a walk through the woods. The deck of the Mouche was covered with passengers, for the sun in early spring draws one out of the house in spite of themselves, and everybody moves about, goes and comes, and talks to his neighbor. I had a girl neighbor, a little work girl no doubt, who possessed the true Parisian charm. A little head with light curly hair, which looked like a shimmer of light as it danced in the wind, came down to her ears and descended to the nape of her neck, where it became such fine light-colored down that one could scarcely see it, but felt an irresistible desire to shower kisses on it. Under my persistent gaze, she turned her head toward me and then immediately looked down, while a slight crease at the side of her mouth, that was ready to break out into a smile, also showed a fine silky pale down which the sun was gilding a little. The calm river grew wider, the atmosphere was warm and perfectly still, but a murmur of life seemed to fill all space. My neighbor raised her eyes again, and this time, as I was still looking at her, she smiled decidedly. She was charming, and in her passing glance I saw 1,000 things which I had hitherto been ignorant of, for I perceived unknown depths, all the charm of tenderness, all the poetry which we dream of, all the happiness which we are continually in search of. I felt an insane longing to open my arms and to carry her off somewhere, so as to whisper the sweet music of words of love into her ears. I was just about to address her when somebody touched me on the shoulder, and as I turned round in some surprise, I saw an ordinary-looking man who was neither young nor old, and who gazed at me sadly. "I should like to speak to you," he said. I made a grimace, which he no doubt saw, for he added, "It is a matter of importance." I got up, therefore, and followed him to the other end of the boat, and then he said, "Monsieur, when winter comes, with its cold, wet, and snowy weather, your doctor says to you constantly, 'Keep your feet warm, guard against chills, colds, bronchitis, rheumatism, and pleurisy.' Then you are very careful. You wear flannel, a heavy greatcoat, and thick shoes, but all this does not prevent you from passing 2 months in bed. But when spring returns, with its leaves and flowers, its warm, soft breezes, and its smell of the fields, all of which causes you vague disquiet and causeless emotion, nobody says to you, 'Monsieur, beware of love.' It is lying in ambush everywhere. It is watching for you at every corner. All its snares are laid, all its weapons are sharpened, all its guiles are prepared. Beware of love, beware of love. It is more dangerous than brandy, bronchitis, or pleurisy. It never forgives and makes everybody commit irreparable follies. Yes, monsieur, I say that the French government ought to put large public notices on the walls with these words: Return of spring, French citizens, beware of love, just as they put beware of paint. However, as the government will not do this, I must supply its place, and I say to you, beware of love, for it is just going to seize you, and it is my duty to inform you of it, just as in Russia they inform anyone that his nose is frozen. I was much astonished at this individual, and assuming a dignified manner, I said, Really, monsieur, you appear to me to be interfering in a matter which is no concern of yours. He made an abrupt movement and replied, Ah, monsieur, if I see that a man is in danger of being drowned at a dangerous spot, ought I to let him perish? So just listen to my story, and you will see why I ventured to speak to you like this. It was about this time last year that it occurred. But first of all, I must tell you that I am a clerk in the Admiralty, where our chiefs, the commissioners, take their gold lace as quill-driving officials seriously, and treat us like forecastle men on board a ship. Well, from my office I could see a small bit of blue sky and the swallows, and I felt inclined to dance among my portfolios. My yearning for freedom grew so intense that in spite of my repugnance, I went to see my chief, a short, bad-tempered man, who was always in a rage. When I told him that I was not well, he looked at me and said, I do not believe it, monsieur, but be off with you. Do you think that any office can go on with clerks like you? I started at once and went down the Seine. It was a day like this, and I took the mouche to go as far as St. Cloud. Ah, what a good thing it would have been if my chief had refused me permission to leave the office that day. I seemed to myself to expand in the sun. I loved everything, the steamer, the river, the trees, the houses, and my fellow passengers. I felt inclined to kiss something, no matter what. It was love laying its snare. Presently, at the Trocadero, a girl, with a small parcel in her hand, came on board and sat down opposite me. She was decidedly pretty, but it is surprising, monsieur, how much prettier women seem to us when the day is fine, at the beginning of the spring. Then they have an intoxicating charm, something quite peculiar about them. It is just like drinking wine after cheese. I looked at her, and she also looked at me, but only occasionally, as that girl did at you just now. But at last, by dint of looking at each other constantly, it seemed to me that we knew each other well enough to enter into conversation, and I spoke to her, and she replied. She was decidedly pretty and nice, and she intoxicated me, monsieur. She got out at St. Cloud, and I followed her. She went and delivered her parcel, and when she returned, the boat had just started. I walked by her side, and the warmth of the air made us both sigh. It would be very nice in the woods, I said. Indeed it would, she replied. Shall we go there for a walk, mademoiselle? She gave me a quick upward look, as if to see exactly what I was like, and then, after a little hesitation, she accepted my proposal, and soon we were there, walking side by side. Under the foliage, which was still rather scanty, the tall, thick, bright green grass was inundated by the sun, and the air was full of insects that were also making love to one another, and birds were singing in all directions. My companion began to jump and to run, intoxicated by the air and the smell of the country, and I ran and jumped, following her example. How silly we are at times, monsieur. Then she sang unrestrainedly 1,000 things, opera airs and the song of Musette. The song of Musette! How poetical it seemed to me then. I almost cried over it. Ah, those silly songs make us lose our heads, and believe me, never marry a woman who sings in the country, especially if she sings the song of Musette. She soon grew tired and sat down on the grassy slope, and I sat at her feet and took her hands, her little hands, that were so marked with the needle and that filled me with emotion. I said to myself, "These are the sacred marks of toil. Oh, monsieur, do you know what those sacred marks of toil mean? They mean all the gossip of the workroom, the whispered scandal, the mind soiled by all the filth that is talked. They mean lost chastity, foolish chatter, all the wretchedness of their everyday life, all the narrowness of ideas which belongs to women of the lower orders, combined to their fullest extent in the girl whose fingers bear the sacred marks of toil." Then we looked into each other's eyes for a long while. Oh, what power a woman's eye has! How it agitates us, how it invades our very being, takes possession of us, and dominates us. How profound it seems, how full of infinite promises. People call that looking into each other's souls. Oh, monsieur, what humbug! If we could see into each other's souls, we should be more careful of what we did. However, I was captivated and was crazy about her, and tried to take her into my arms, but she said, "Paws off." Then I knelt down and opened my heart to her and poured out all the affection that was suffocating me. She seemed surprised at my change of manner and gave me a sidelong glance, as if to say, "Ah, so that is the way women make a fool of you, old fellow. Very well, we will see." In love, monsieur, we are always novices, and women artful dealers. No doubt I could have had her, and I saw my own stupidity later, but what I wanted was not a woman's person, it was love, it was the ideal. I was sentimental when I ought to have been using my time to a better purpose. As soon as she had had enough of my declarations of affection, she got up, and we returned to St. Cloud, and I did not leave her until we got to Paris. But she had looked so sad as we were returning that at last I asked her what was the matter. "I am thinking," she replied, "that this has been one of those days of which we have but few in life." My heart beat so that it felt as if it would break my ribs. I saw her on the following Sunday, and the next Sunday, and every Sunday. I took her to Bougival, Saint-Germain, Maison Lafitte, Poissy, to every suburban resort of lovers. The little jade, in turn, pretended to love me, until at last I altogether lost my head, and 3 months later I married her. What can you expect, monsieur, when a man is a clerk, living alone without any relations, or anyone to advise him? One says to oneself, "How sweet life would be with a wife!" And so one gets married, and she calls you names from morning till night, understands nothing, knows nothing, chatters continually, sings the song of Musette at the top of her voice. Oh, that song of Musette, how tired one gets of it! Quarrels with the charcoal dealer, tells the janitor all her domestic details, confides all the secrets of her bedroom to the neighbor's servant, discusses her husband with the tradespeople, and has her head so stuffed with stupid stories, with idiotic superstitions, with extraordinary ideas and monstrous prejudices, that I, for what I have said applies more particularly to myself, shed tears of discouragement every time I talk to her. He stopped as he was rather out of breath and very much moved, and I looked at him, for I felt pity for this poor artless devil, and I was just going to give some sort of answer when the boat stopped. We were at St. Cloud. The little woman who had taken my fancy rose from her seat in order to land. She passed close to me and gave me a sidelong glance and a furtive smile, one of those smiles that drive you wild. Then she jumped on the landing stage. I sprang forward to follow her, but my neighbor laid hold of my arm. I shook myself loose, however, whereupon he seized the skirt of my coat and pulled me back, exclaiming, "You shall not go, you shall not go," in such a loud voice that everybody turned round and laughed, and I remained standing motionless and furious, but without venturing to face scandal and ridicule. And the steamboat started. The little woman on the landing stage looked at me as I went off with an air of disappointment, while my persecutor rubbed his hands and whispered to me, "You must acknowledge that I have done you a great service." End of In the Spring by Guy de Maupassant.
In Springtime by Rudyard Kipling. Coffee Break Collection 31. Recording by Phil Schempf. In Springtime. My garden blazes brightly with the rosebush and the peach, and the koil sings above it in the cirrus by the well. From the creeper-covered trellis comes the squirrel's chattering speech, and the blue jay screams and flutters where the cheery sought-by dwell. But the rose has lost its fragrance, and the koil's note is strange. I am sick of endless sunshine, sick of blossom-burdened bough. Give me back the leafless woodlands where the winds of springtime range. Give me back one day in England, for it's springtime in England now. Through the pines the gusts are booming, o'er the brown fields blowing chill. From the furrow of the plowshare streams the fragrance of the loam, and the hawk nests on the cliffside, and the jackdaw in the hill. And my heart is back in England, mid the sights and sounds of home. But the garland of the sacrifice, this wealth of rose and peach is. Ah, koil, little koil, singing on the cirrus bough. In my ears the knell of exile, your ceaseless bell-like speech is. Can you tell me aught of England, or of spring in England now? End of In Springtime. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The Spring Maiden and the Frost Giants by Eleanor L. Skinner. Coffee Break Collection 31. Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Annie Mars. The Spring Maiden and the Frost Giants. In their glittering palace of icebergs, the Frost Giants were planning to capture Iduna, the fair Spring Maiden, and the rare treasure which she guarded. Hoarfrost, Northwind, Sleet, Hail, and Blizzard were growing restless, locked in their frozen wasteland of the north. They longed to enter the Valley of Spring and bring desolation to the fruitful lands. "We are helpless unless we seize the Spring Maiden and take from her the casket of golden apples," said giant Hoarfrost. "So long as she guards this life-giving fruit, all nature will rejoice. The birds will sing their foolish jubilees, gay blossoms will flaunt in the meadows, robes of green will bedeck the trees, and the people will enjoy everlasting youth and vigor." "What you say is true," said giant Northwind. "If once I could enter the groves of the Spring Maiden's valley, I'd howl so long and loud that those tiresome birds would stop their endless singing." "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed giant Blizzard. "You would need my help, I believe. One of my early morning calls would turn the trembling dewdrops into icicles, and change the smiling faces of the brooks and rills into frozen images." "Especially if I went with you," added giant Sleet slyly. "Oh, I should expect to be accompanied by you and your twin brother Hail," nodded Blizzard. "I know how easily you lock the grass and flowers in the casement of ice which they couldn't break, and Hail has a very clever, quick way of cutting off all the leaves. But the question now is, how shall we capture the Spring Maiden, whose apples keep the valley fresh and fair, and the people forever young?" For a few moments the Frost Giants were silent. Many times they tried to entrap the fair Iduna and her treasure, but they had always failed. "I have it," said Hoarfrost. "We must secure the help of Loki, the Prince of Mischief. He lives in Asgard near the Spring Maiden's groves, and people say he often visits Iduna in order to refresh himself with one of her life-giving apples. Let us capture him first and then compel him to help us. We giants are fast growing old. The magic apples would renew our strength for years to come." "Agreed," said North Wind, Blizzard, Sleet, and Hail in one voice. "Loki first, and then Iduna." After much discussion, it was decided that Blizzard should undertake the capture of Loki. A short time after the council of the Frost Giants, Loki, the Prince of Mischief, was amusing himself with a great fire which he had built on one of the hills just beyond the city of Asgard. Several times he stopped and peered into the sky to see what caused the huge shadow which seemed to hover near him. He could see nothing but a gigantic eagle whirling around the summit of the hill. Loki left his fire to gather another bundle of faggots. Suddenly the great bird swooped down very near him. He quickly seized a long stake and struck the intruder across the back. To Loki's amazement, one end of the stake stuck fast to the eagle's plumage, and the Prince of Mischief could not loosen his hands from the end which he held. The eagle spread its huge dark wings and flew away over rocks and hills far to the north. "Help! Help!" screamed the terrified Loki, but although he struggled with all his might, he could not escape from his captor. When they reached a very lonely spot, the eagle alighted on a mountain peak, and from the black plumage stepped the storm giant Blizzard, who said, "Loki, you are in my power, and you shall not escape until you promise to help the Frost Giant in a very difficult undertaking." "What is that?" gasped the bruised and terrified Loki. "You must help us to capture Iduna, the Spring Maiden, and the treasure she guards. We cannot enter the Valley of Spring until Iduna is made our captive." "Help you to capture the treasure which gives life and youth to all who partake of it?" said Loki. "Impossible!" "Then away to the north we will go," declared the storm giant, putting on his eagle plumage again. "Stop! Stop!" cried Loki in terror. "Look at me a moment." After a short consideration, Loki took an oath that he would betray Iduna and her treasure into the hands of the Frost Giants. Then the Prince of Mischief was freed, and back to the north sped Blizzard. The next day, late in the afternoon, Iduna, robed in a trailing garment of green and crowned with a coronet of blossoms, was walking through one of her loveliest groves. The leaves were dancing to the music of a gentle breeze. A delicious fragrance of hyacinths and roses scented the valley. She sat down near a cool fountain and placed her treasure casket of apples on the marble basin. Presently a long shadow darkened the path near her, and looking up quickly, the Spring Maiden saw Loki standing near. "I have come for the refreshing gift of one of your apples, Iduna," said he. "A long journey has wearied my limbs and broken my spirit." "You are very welcome to one of them," said Iduna, opening her box. "It has been some time since you tasted a golden apple." Loki began to eat the precious gift, and Iduna watched him closely. She was very proud of her refreshing fruit. In a little while he put the half-eaten apple on the basin of the fountain and said, "I am going to tell you a secret, Iduna. Not far away from here I discovered a grove where a marvelous tree grows. It bears fruit shaped like yours, but larger and of a deep golden color." "Oh!" laughed the Spring Maiden. "The fruit may be larger and more beautiful than mine, but I'm sure it has not the power to put youth and life into those who partake of it." "I am afraid you are mistaken," said the wily Loki. "People who have eaten the fruit of this tree say that its refreshing power is wonderful. If you wish, I will gladly guide you to the grove. It is not far away, and then you can compare this fruit, which is attracting much attention, with yours. Will you go?" "Yes, I will indeed," said Iduna, who could not believe that any other apples were comparable with hers. Loki led the way, and Iduna, carrying her treasure, followed him eagerly. She was a little surprised to find the grove Loki described so far away from Asgard, but her desire to find fruit more wonderful than the magic apples urged her on. Finally, they reached a meadow bordered by a dense forest. "Look," said Loki, pointing forward. "We shall soon reach the place." Suddenly a dark shadow fell across Iduna's path. The storm giant, disguised in eagle's plumage, swooped down, caught the spring maiden and her golden apples in his talons, and sped away to the frozen north. There the frost giants imprisoned the captive in one of their ice palaces. It was not long before the joyous valley of spring felt the absence of Iduna. The flowers drooped and faded, the grass became parched and brown, and the tender green foliage turned to burnt orange, crimson, and russet. "What has become of Iduna?" cried the people. "See how the valley is changing!" Slowly but surely the frost giants were working their way towards the Valley of Spring. One night Hoarfrost stalked along the outskirts of the groves and withered the leaves and flowers with his icy breath. The next morning the people heard the dismal howl of North Wind. "We must find the Spring Maiden, or we shall die!" they cried in alarm. In their distress they begged Odin, the wise hero who governed Asgard, to call a special council in order to determine how the secret of Iduna's disappearance could be discovered. Odin called together his hero council, and after earnest thought they decided to question Loki, the Prince of Mischief. He had seldom been seen in Asgard since the Spring Maiden had left the valley. One of the heroes declared that the last time he saw Iduna, she was walking with Loki. The Prince of Mischief was accordingly summoned to appear in the Council of Heroes. His answers to the questions they asked him aroused suspicion. "Tell us the truth of this matter," said the hero Thor, in a voice which shook like the roar of distant thunder. Then the cowardly Loki confessed the plot which robbed the valley of the Spring Maiden and her magic apples. "Loki," said Odin sternly, "I command you to bring back Iduna. Let there be no delay, for even the heroes of Asgard are suffering in her absence." Loki knew he dared not disobey this final command. He disguised himself in falcon's plumage and sped away to the desolate north, where a dull leaden sky overhung in the land. Encircling about the icebergs, he spied the storm giant fishing from the top of a large rock. Loki descended quickly, flew into one of the openings of the giant's ice palace, and made his way to the place where Iduna lay sleeping on a rough couch. The Prince of Mischief stepped out of his disguise and awakened the Spring Maiden. "False Loki," she cried, "have you come to do more mischief?" "I have been sent by Odin to rescue you," said he. "You can escape only by the help of my magic." Then he transformed Iduna and the precious casket of apples, placed them in a magic nutshell, put on his falcon plumage, and flew away toward Asgard. As he sped across the dull sky, the storm giant looked up and saw him. "It is Loki, disguised as a falcon," he said. "He is taking the Spring Maiden back to Asgard, but he shall not escape me." Instantly the storm giant put on his eagle plumage and flew after Loki. How anxiously the people of Asgard watched for the return of Loki with Iduna. They heaped great piles of chips around the walls of Asgard and held torches ready to light the fires in case the frost giants came near. On the third day after Loki's departure from Asgard, the people saw two great birds flying with lightning speed toward the city. "It is the storm giant following Loki," they cried. "What a furious pursuit! See, see, the eagle is gaining on the falcon. Light the fires as soon as Loki passes over. Ready, the fires!" Another moment of breathless suspense. The falcon swept over the walls of Asgard. Instantly a blaze burst forth all around the city. The falcon had won the mighty race. The eagle whirled far above the flames and looked down into the city. He dared not descend. With a cry of despair he sped back to the ice-bound Northland. "The joyous Spring Maiden is ours again," cried the happy people as they gathered around Iduna. "Her presence fills us with life and hope. See, the casket of golden apples is safe in her hands. Soon all nature will be fair and beautiful. The Spring Maiden is our joy." End of The Spring Maiden and the Frost Giants. Recording by Annie Mars.
Mother's Nature's House Cleaning by Allan Robina Field. Coffee Break Collection 31. Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by TallyTiger. Mother Nature's House Cleaning. One morning, Mother Nature stood at her door of her house, looking out over the world. King Winter's reign was over, and he had gone back to his home at the North Pole, and spring was coming over the hill with her 3 little helpers to make Mother Nature a visit. Let us see who those helpers were. First, there was roguish March, with his rose cheeks and his curly hair flying in the wind that blew all around him. Next came baby April with her apron full of violets, daffodils and green grasses. Part of the time she smiled sweetly, and part of it she frowned till the big teardrops chased each other down her cheeks. Last came May, playing tag with the sunbeams, wandering knee-deep in flowers and calling to the birds that sang around her. Mother Nature watched them coming and murmured, "Such a dirty world as King Winter has left behind him. It must be cleaned up before the little girls April and May come, but March, I am sure, will want to help me do it." She beckoned to the frolicsome boy, who came racing down the hill to see what she wanted. "I must have some rain to wash away all this dirty snow," she said. So March whistled to the east wind, who blew together the rain clouds, and soon the tiny raindrops were busy at work, washing the floors of the world. And in a short time the snow was all gone. Then Mother Nature wanted the sky ceilings cleaned, so this time March whistled to the west wind, who began to sweep away the cloud cobwebs from the sky, till the cheery old sun smiled again, and shone Mother Nature a bright good morning. "Now, March," she said, "there is one more thing you can do to help. You must start to work for baby April." Then March, with the south wind to help him, awoke the seeds, whispered to the trees to begin to bud, starting the brook singing, and called the robins back from the south. When his visit was over, Mother Nature thanked him for helping her so well on all of the 31 days he had spent with her, and told him she would send for him again when the next cleaning day came around. End of Mother Nature's House Cleaning. Recorded by TallyTiger. The Red Bud Tree by Allan C. Babbitt. Coffee Break Collection 31. Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by TallyTiger. The Red Bud Tree. Once upon a time, 4 young princes heard a story about a certain wonderful tree called the Red Bud Tree. No one of them had ever seen a red bud tree, and each prince wished to be the first to see one. So the eldest prince asked the driver of the king's chariot to take him deep into the woods where the tree grew. It was still very early in the spring, and the tree had no leaves nor buds. It was black and bare like a dead tree. The prince could not understand why this was called a red bud tree, but he asked no questions. Later in the spring, the next son went with the driver of the king's chariot to see the red bud tree. At this time it was covered with red buds. The tree was covered with green leaves when the third son went into the wood a little later to see it. He asked no questions about it, but he could see no reason for calling it the redbud tree. Sometime after this, the youngest prince begged to be taken to see the redbud tree. By this time it was covered with little bean pods. When he came back from the woods, he ran into the garden where his brothers were playing, crying, "I have seen the redbud tree." "So have I," said the eldest prince. "It did not look like much of a tree to me," said he. "It looked like a dead tree. It was black and bare." "What makes you say that?" said the second son. "The tree had hundreds of beautiful red buds. This is why it's called the redbud tree." The third prince said, "Red buds, did you say? Why did you say that it has red buds? It's covered with green leaves." The prince who had seen the tree last laughed at his brother, saying, "I have just seen that tree, and it's not like a dead tree. It has neither red buds nor green leaves on it. It is covered with little bean pods." The king heard them and waited on they stopped talking. Then he said, "My sons, you have all four seen the same tree, but each of you saw it at a different time of the year." End of The Redbud Tree. Recording by TallyTiger.
The Spring Lover and the Autumn Lover by Grace James. Coffee Break Collection 31. Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annie Mars. The Spring Lover and the Autumn Lover. This is a story of the youth of Yamato, when the gods still walked upon the land of the reed plains and took pleasure in the fresh and waving rice ears of the countryside. There was a lady having in her something of earth and something of heaven. She was a king's daughter. She was augustly radiant and renowned. She was called the dear delight of the world, the greatly desired, the fairest of the fair. She was slender and strong, at once mysterious and gay, fickle yet faithful, gentle yet hard to please. The gods loved her, but men worshipped her. The coming of the dear delight was on this wise. Prince Amaboko had a red jewel of one of his enemies. The jewel was a peace offering. Prince Amaboko set it in a casket upon a stand. He said, "This is a jewel of price." Then the jewel transformed into an exceedingly fair lady. Her name was the Lady of the Red Jewel, and Prince Amaboko took her to wife. There was born to them only one daughter, who was the greatly desired, the fairest of fair. It is true that 18 men of name came to seek her hand. Princes they were, and warriors and deities. They came from near and they came from far. Across the sea path they came in great ships, white sails or creaking oars, with brave and lusty sailors. Through the forest dark and dangerous they made their way to the princess, the greatly desired, or lightly they descended by way of the floating bridge, in garments of glamour and silver shod. They brought their gifts with them, gold, fair jewels upon a string, light garments of feathers, singing birds, sweet things to eat, silk cocoons, oranges in a basket. They brought minstrels and singers and dancers and tellers of tales to entertain the princess, the greatly desired. As for the princess, she sat still in her white bower with her maidens about her. Passing rich was her robe, and ever and anon her maidens spread it afresh over the mats, set out her deep sleeves, or combed her long hair with a golden comb. Round about the bower was a gallery of white wood, and here the suitors came and knelt in the presence of their liege lady. Many and many a time the carp leapt in the golden fish pond. Many and many a time a scarlet pomegranate flower fluttered and dropped from the tree. Many and many a time the lady shook her head, and a lover went his way, sad and sorry. Now it happened that the god of autumn went to try his fortune with the princess. He was a brave young man indeed. Ardent were his eyes, the colour flamed in his dark cheek. He was girded with a sword that 10 men could not lift. The chrysanthemums of autumn burned upon his coat in cunning broidery. He came and bent his proud head to the very ground before the princess, then raised it and looked her full in the eyes. She opened her sweet red lips, waited, said nothing, but shook her head. So the god of autumn went forth from her presence, blinded with his bitter tears. He found his younger brother, the god of spring. "How fares it with you, my brother?" said the god of spring. "Ill, ill indeed, for she will not have me. She is the proud lady, mine is the broken heart." "Ah, my brother," said the god of spring. "You'd best come home with me, for all is over with us," said the god of autumn. But the god of spring said, "I stay here." "What?" cried his brother. "Is it likely then that she will take you if she'll have none of me? Will she love the smooth cheeks of a child and flout the man full grown? Will you go to her, brother? She'll laugh at you for your pains." "Still, I will go," said the god of spring. A wager, the god of autumn cried. "I'll give you a cask of sake if you win her. Sake for the merry feast of your wedding. If you lose her, the sake will be for me. I'll drown my grief in it." "Well, brother," said the god of spring, "I take the wager. You'll have your sake like enough indeed." "And so I think," said the god of autumn, and went his ways. Then the young god of spring went to his mother, who loved him. "Do you love me, my mother?" he said. She answered, "More than 100 existences." "Mother," he said, "get me for my wife the princess, the fairest of the fair. She is called the greatly desired. Greatly, oh greatly do I desire her." "You love her, my son?" said his mother. "More than 100 existences," he said. "Then lie down, my son, my best beloved, lie down and sleep, and I will work for you." So she spread a couch for him, and when he was asleep she looked on him. "Your face," she said, "is the sweetest thing in the world." There was no sleep for her the livelong night, but she went swiftly to a place she knew of, where the wisteria drooped over a pool. She plucked her spray and tendrils and brought home as much as she could carry. The wisteria was white and purple. You must know it was not yet in flower, but hidden in the unopened bud. From it she wove magically a robe. She fashioned sandals and a bow and arrows. In the morning she waked the god of spring. "Come, my son," she said, "let me put this robe on you." The god of spring rubbed his eyes. "A sober suit for courting," he said, but he did as his mother bade him, and he bound the sandals on his feet, and slung the bow and the arrows in their quiver on his back. "Will all be well, my mother?" he said. "All will be well, beloved," she answered him. So the god of spring came before the fairest of the fair, and one of her maidens laughed and said, "See, mistress, there comes to woo you today only a little plain boy, all in sober grey." But the fairest of the fair lifted up her eyes and looked upon the god of spring, and in the same moment the wisteria which he was clothed burst into flower. He was sweet-scented, white and purple from head to heel. The princess rose from the white mats. "Lord," she said, "I am yours if you will have me." Hand in hand they went together to the mother of the god of spring. "Ah, my mother," he said, "what will I do now? My brother, the god of autumn, is angry with me. He will not give me the sake I have won from him in the wager. Great is his rage. He will seek to take our lives." "Be still, beloved," said his mother, "and fear not." She took a cane of hollow bamboo, and in the hollow she put salt and stones, and when she had wrapped the cane round with leaves, she hung it in the smoke and fire and said, "The green leaves fade and die, so must you do, my eldest born, the god of autumn. The stone sinks in the sea, so you must sink. You must sink, and you must fail like the ebb tide." Now the tale is told, and all the world knows why. Spring is fresh and merry and young, and autumn is the saddest thing that is. End of The Spring Lover and the Autumn Lover. Recording by Annie Mars.
Signs of Spring, from In the Open, Intimate Studies and Appreciations of Nature, by Stanton Davis Kirkham. Coffee Break Collection 31, Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The approach of spring is felt rather than reasoned about. There is that in us which rises to greet the incoming tide of the year before our eyes have apprised us of any change. Winter lies over the world much as ashes are banked on coals for the night, which nevertheless retain their heat and will be found alive and glowing in the morning. In the tropics the fire is not banked, and there is no cold dawn with anticipations of the kindly blaze soon to arise, no gradual uncovering of the cheerful coals. Here in New England, the dawn is rigorous and spring more welcome. The winter buds are evidence that it is not far away, and it takes but the least encouragement at any time for this latent heat and life to awake and show itself in the high blueberry twigs. Such buoyant faith has the skunk cabbage, it never entirely loses sight of spring, but exerts some spell over its muddy bed, whereby you may see that there, at least, it has already come in November. The reddening of the twigs is in effect a prelude, and precedes the real spring as dawn precedes daylight, or twilight the night. This is the dawn of the year, and these blueberry twigs its first flush. Smilax turns suddenly green as the sap circulates in its spiny stems, and the brown and sere aspect of the earth is relieved and enlivened. This early green is as refreshing to the eye as the first rhubarb to the palate. One of the earliest signs is the little rosette of bright-colored leaves on the smaller hair-cap mosses, growing in contact with an outcropping ledge. You may see whole patches in the pastures, varying from orange to deep red, a vivid bit of color next to the brown earth and looking like diminutive blossoms. Then come the fruiting spikes of the common field horsetails, poking out of some sandbank. These signs of the awakening season appeal to the trained eye rather than to the casual glance. Such an one detects the slightest swelling of a leaf bud, the faint reddening of a twig, the deeper green of another. The sap dripping from the freshly cut limb of a birch, or pendant from the wound in a long glittering icicle, is evidence of the quickened circulation of the earth. Among the thick mat of dry leaves, you may perhaps find the delicate shoots of wood anemones, and in the swamps, the tightly rolled stipes of the osmunda, like little croziers, while there is ice yet in the leaves of the pitcher plant. Deep lying in all men is a poetic vein which now appears on the surface. The first pussy willows and the arrival of bluebirds arouse sentiments as common to us as the love of music, some suggestion of renewal, of awakening after the sleep of winter, which touches even the rough man and makes him kin for a day to the child. We embark each year on the sea of winter, with unquestioning faith that on its other shore spring awaits us, once more to shake the violets from her lap. When in March that shore looms in the distance, we feel the joy of travelers in sight of their native land. There may be rough seas, and March winds are blustery, but there, in sight, nevertheless, is that faint outline on the horizon. No blossoming rod of Aaron could appear more miraculous than do the flowering willows. These twigs of brown and lifeless aspect suddenly burst into bloom and array themselves in exquisite silvery gray catkins, while the snow may be still on the ground. Not long after, the alders in the swamp unfold their clusters of drooping aments which have been on the tree stiff and rigid throughout the winter. Thousands of little tails are thus mysteriously hung out on the alder twigs to sway gently in the breeze, turning from a reddish hue to a sulphur yellow as they expand and become powdered with pollen. Born into a frosty world, when the feeble sun is still distant and cold, the March flowers are a link between winter and spring. But nature has certainly relaxed her features. There is just the ghost of a smile on her icy lips. This year I heard the bluebirds warble on the 4th of February, but did not see the bird, and heard no more till early in March, when they came in flocks. Out of the sky comes to us this liquid note, as if the heavens had opened and poured upon us their benediction. How sweet it is to the ear! What music to the heart! And when suddenly a little flock starts up from the wall or fence, how rich and welcome to the eye, long denied its modicum of color, is the blue of their backs. We have had little but artificial tastes and colors and perfumes for so long that the senses seize with avidity these first offerings. We are hungry for them. It changes the whole aspect of things when on some raw day the first redwing of the season appears, a vivid bit of color in the bleak swamp, a hopeful and melodious voice breaking the silence of the year. The birds are shy and elusive on their arrival, and we have every year to become acquainted again. Even the robins are furtive and silent, flitting in the sheltered swamps. But the middle of March finds them calling to each other in their old jocular way. Drawn by the same subtle influence, the angleworm seems to work toward the surface about the time the robin is thinking of the lawn, till one day they meet as by appointment. If the season is late, the worm retires below where it is less frosty, and the robin takes to the sumac berries, or whatever else he can find, and defers his spring relish a little longer. Round about there is an awakening as from an enchanted sleep. The drowsy world yawns and stretches. The high hole is in evidence, and his rattling call is calculated to awake the sleepers in that pasture at least. Soon the chipmunk is on the wall, and the woodchuck warily pokes his head from his burrow. This note of the high hole is irrepressibly exuberant and ringing with energy. If it does not prove a tonic to you, nothing else will. He is even more emphatic in his drumming. His lively tattoo goes well with his vigorous call. Time to be up and doing. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Presently the first flock of fox sparrows drop down from somewhere and go to scratching among the leaves, like so many chickens. The present season a flock of perhaps 50 settled in and around a thicket on March 24th. Their bold, clear notes could be heard some distance away, and drew one in that direction. Numbers of them were hopping about, and occasionally a bird would arise to a branch overhead and sing, looking like a hermit thrush as his back was turned. The place was given over to the sparrows, and never was thicket more tuneful. There was the sound of unceasing revelry, a sylvan and melodious revelry. At this season, the impulse to expression is natural and daily becomes more evident. Even the crow begins to affect music and to show off his accomplishments. But it is Mademoiselle Corbeau, and not Monsieur Reynard, that incites him to this exhibition of vanity. You may hear him in the pine grove, apparently gargling his throat, which is meant for a gay roulade to please the ear of some dusky beauty lingering near and perhaps affecting indifference. This is only a prelude to the astonishing falsetto that sometimes follows, and which, be it hoped, may prove more acceptable to Mademoiselle Corbeau than to our more critical ears. It is very evident something is going on. The large flocks of winter have given way to small and excited bands which keep up a perpetual clamor. It is no surprise, then, some day in March, to detect a crow carrying twigs. At no other time is there such concerted singing among the song sparrows as in these first days of the arrival of any considerable flocks. From bare fields and brown hedgerows arises this simple and spontaneous expression of joy, a primitive invocation to the goddess Spring, fresh and clear and innocent as the morning itself. As they hop about among the dry weeds, one will now and then pick up a straw and hold it meditatively a moment with some premonition of the nest. Presently they will be flitting among the still leafless brambles and briars with an air of secrecy and importance. Some bright morning in March there comes to the listening ear the song of the purple finch, a wild, sweet strain with the abandon of gypsy music, which thrills with its very wildness and unrestraint. Anon Phoebe arrives with dry little voice and familiar swoop after the first incautious fly. Every season has its characteristic song. more than all others is the voice of the hyla, essentially spring-like and to be associated with no other time. For several days, there has been an occasional desultory chirp from the woods, when of a sudden, some clear evening there comes out of the stillness that wonderfully sweet piping of little frogs. Fresh and ringing as child voices, it has, at a distance, a certain rhythm, a soothing cadence, which lulls the ear like the musical patter of raindrops in summer showers. Put your ear close to one, if you can find him, and the sound is deafening, so loud and shrill it pierces to the very marrow. The small creature sits in some low shrub in the swamp, grasping a twig on either side as with tiny hands, while it inflates its air sac from time to time and sings the love song of its race. Heard afar, how soft and pleasing are these answering calls of the hylas, which are the very voice of the evening itself. About the time the hylas begin to sing in chorus, you may look for the appearance of the leopard frog. He is to be heard at midday in his pond uttering a most deliberate and prolonged snore, evenly and smoothly drawn out, as if his sleep were dreamless and content. Presently there is an answering snore, full as deliberate and serene, from across the pond, followed by long intervals of silence. Very different from this somnolent song of the leopard frog is the shrilling of garden toads. Not everyone would recognize the solemn and dusty toad of the flower beds that flops from under the feet in the dusk in this brighter-colored creature, floating at full length in the shallow water, his air sac inflated before him like a party-colored bubble. The shrilling of toads fills the air. They are under a spell, a witchery, which has set them all to chanting this single strain, high-pitched and subdued, with a sort of mild frenzy. April brings the twittering of tree swallows, and spreads a tinge of color like a faint red mist over the swamps. This flower of the maple is one whose virtues are seldom sung, as though the blossoms of trees counted for little. Surely the bursting of silver-gray rods into this vivid bloom is an event worthy the muse. It is not only in autumn the red maple graces the swamp. These modest blossoms of the early year, willow, alder, poplar, elm, maple, must have their place in the flower calendar, are worthy a festival of trees, to be associated with the song of the hyla. Anything like an exact flower calendar is out of the question, for much depends on the locality and the season. We look for bloodroot and hepatica to follow arbutus, and yet I have on occasion found bluets several weeks in advance of these. The saxifrage is perhaps quite as early as any, though I have seen the buds of the marsh marigold about to open on the 25th of March. Much depends on which has the more favorable spot in any locality. In a warm nook on the 13th of April, bloodroot, hepatica, spring beauty, early saxifrage, dicentra, wood and rue anemones, and adder's tongue, as well as common blue and long-spurred violets, were blooming together in profusion. The saxifrage and bloodroot might, of course, have been seen a week earlier. In the same spot several days later, columbines, mitrewort, and groundnut, and also sweet white violets, downy yellow and lance-leaved violets, were added to the list and were followed by bellworts and wood betony. This was in northern New Jersey. Meanwhile, I had seen only the common blue violets in the Connecticut Valley, while in eastern Massachusetts, the wood anemones were not in bloom, and the leaf of the columbine had just appeared above the soil. This particular spot was evidently a sort of natural forcing ground where the columbine was made to bloom with the bloodroot. What becomes of your flower calendar here? Looking still for signs of spring, I came full upon the fickle goddess herself. Before we know it, the migration of warblers has begun, and the keen ear detects their thin, wiry notes. But this is not so much a sign as it is the fulfilling of prophecies. End of Signs of Spring, from In the Open, Intimate Studies and Appreciations of Nature.
Spring Cleaning by Harry Graham. Coffee Break Collection 31, Springtime. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. Spring Cleaning. Let me sing in mournful numbers of the sorrows of the spring, when the house is full of plumbers and the builder has his fling. Ladders lean on every landing, pails repose on every stair. Painters, who on planks are standing, block the road to everywhere, and with pigments evil smelling, drive us from our dismal dwelling. Stairs are carpetless to step on, banisters are far from dry, while, like Damocles' weapon, plaster threatens from on high. Any room we chance to enter, our depression but completes. Chairs and tables in the center hide beneath encircling sheets, and the painters, horrid vandals, have deprived the doors of handles. Workmen through our windows peering, spread their pitfalls in our path. Daily are we found adhering to some freshly painted bath. Daily have our cooks contended that, however great our grief, till the kitchen range be mended, we must live on frigid beef. And at last we grasp the meaning of that fatal phrase, spring cleaning. End of Spring Cleaning by Harry Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Spring Cleaning for Motor Car Important by Anonymous. From the New York Times, March 4th, 1917. Coffee Break Collection 31, Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Spring Cleaning for Motor Car Important. What should be done to prepare auto for heavier demands of touring season? Attention at right time profitable. Spring comes early in the imagination of the motorist. Already his fancy is beginning to be busy with trips through the countryside when the first faint green of the vernal season raises the spirit to lyric heights, and so forth. It is highly commendable for the motorist to respond to the poetic side of life. But there is also an important prosaic side to the coming of spring in motordom. It is, clean your car, overhaul it thoroughly. One of the large automobile companies has sent out the instructions for spring overhaul. The advice applies to motor car owners generally, and is, to assist both new and old owners, we offer the following suggestions for putting the car in the best possible operating condition. Tires may be bruised or cut, in which case proper care should be given them before it becomes too late for repairs. The smallest cut will allow water to enter and rot the fabric, and if the cut is into the fabric, sand will work under the rubber and loosen the tread. The edges of small cuts should be smoothed with a sharp knife, then roughed with sandpaper, after which the cut should be thoroughly washed out with gasoline and a patching cement applied. After the cement is dried, the hole should be filled with a compound which the tire companies furnish for this purpose. In the case of a large cut or blowout, the casing should be vulcanized. Rust should not be allowed to accumulate on the rims, and painting with a preserver, such as ordinary stove polish, will prevent that condition. The front axle and steering assembly should receive a careful inspection. Excessive play in the front axle assembly can be easily detected by grasping one of the wheels and jerking the axle back and forth. If play has developed in any of the sockets or connections, the turning of the steering wheel will not have immediate effect. If there is play in the radius rods, the studs should be tightened and the ball cap filed if necessary. If inspection shows that the bushings, which constitute the bearing surfaces of the steering post bracket, spindle arm, spindle bodies, and spring perches, are worn to such an extent that play has developed, it is advisable to replace them. If the steering gear has become loose, it can be tightened by disconnecting the two halves of the ball sockets, which surround the ball arm at the lower end of the steering post, and filing off their surfaces until they fit snugly around the ball. If the ball is badly worn, it is best to replace it with a new one. The sockets on the steering gear connecting rod should also be filed down if it is found that the ball has any play in the socket. In replacing the nuts, be sure to put back the cotter pins, Otherwise, the nuts may work off the bolts and cause considerable trouble. It is advisable to go over the chassis frequently in order to see that these adjustments are maintained. The wheels should be removed and the balls and cones inspected. If the bearing surfaces of the cones are rough or considerably worn, or if any of the balls are chipped, they should be replaced, as the cost will be slight compared to the possibility of trouble developing on the road. The old grease should be removed from the hubs and replaced with new. In replacing the wheel, see that it has no side play whatsoever, and tighten the adjusting cone as much as possible without causing the wheel to bind. This can be determined by spinning the wheel, and if it comes to rest with the tire valves directly underneath the hub, it is obvious that the ball bearings are not binding. The rear wheels should be tightened by setting up the lock nuts on the axle shafts as close as possible without stripping the threads, so that the wheel hubs will be tightly wedged on the tapered ends of the axle shafts. It is advisable to remove the hubcaps occasionally throughout the season to see that these adjustments are maintained. If this is not done, play may develop, which will in time cause trouble. It is well to pry the spring leaves apart near the ends with a screwdriver and force lubricating oil or graphite between them. This has a tendency to make the springs more flexible. The nuts on the spring clips, spring perches, spring tie bolts, spindle arms, and spindle bolts should be tightened and cotter pins put in so that the nuts cannot work loose. In fact, it is a good idea that the entire car be gone over it this season and all bolts and nuts tightened. The circulating system should be flushed out by disconnecting the inlet and outlet water connections and allowing water under ordinary pressure to enter the filler neck, flowing down through the tubes into the bottom tank and out of the radiator. The water passages in the cylinder castings may be cleaned out in like manner by a flow of water from the cylinder head to the side inlet connection. The carbon should be removed and the valves ground, as after a season's use there is no question but what the efficiency of your engine can be improved by cleaning the carbon and grinding valves. The dirty oil should be drained from the crankcase, and the case cleaned by the following operations. Remove plug and drain off oil. Replace the plug and pour in a gallon of kerosene oil through the breather pipe. Turn the engine over by hand 15 or 20 times so that the splash from the oil will thoroughly cleanse the engine and transmission parts. Remove the plug and drain off the oil. In order to get all the kerosene out of the depressions in the crankcase, the car should be pushed up a little incline, about the height of an ordinary street curbing. This operation should be repeated approximately every 1,000 miles. The spark plugs should be removed and the points cleaned with gasoline. After cleaning, the points should be adjusted so that the gap between them is 1/32 of an inch, that is, about the thickness of a smooth dime. Examine the commutator and replace the case and fiber assembly if the contacts do not appear in good condition. If the roller is badly worn, that part should also be replaced. If the commutator is dirty, or if there is congealed oil on the parts, it may be cleaned with gasoline. The wiring should be carefully inspected to see that insulation is not badly worn and that there are good connections at all the terminals. If the wiring does not appear to be in proper condition, it is best to replace it. The sediment bulb underneath the gas tank should be drained to remove any water or foreign matter that may have accumulated. If the engine is in such condition as to require extensive adjustments, it will be advisable that such work be left to an experienced mechanic. End of Spring Cleaning for Motor Car Important. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Spring Evening by Friedrich von Matteson. Translated by Alfred Baskerville. Coffee Break Collection 31. Springtime. Spring Evening. By heaven's glow illumined, trembling beams on tender stem the dew. The vernal landscape's quivering image gleams bright in the water's blue. Fair is the rocky fount, the budding tree, the grove of golden hue. Fair is the glittering star of eve when she peers forth from clouds of blue. Fair is the mead, the valley's bush and brake, the mountain's flowery vest, the alder margined stream, the rush-crowned lake with flower-enamelled breast. How doth eternal love all hearts inflame of earth's life-breathing band, the glowworm small, the sun's bright sea of flame, confess a father's hand. Thou nodst when from the tree, Almighty One, a blossom's leaf doth stray. Thou noddest when in boundless space the sun in darkness fades away. End of Spring Evening. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Spring in Town by Lord Dunsany. Coffee Break Collection 31. Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schempf. Spring in Town. At a street corner sat and played with the wind, winter disconsolate. Still tingled the fingers of the passers-by, and still their breath was visible, and still they huddled their chins into their coats when turning a corner they met with a new wind. Still windows lighted early sent out into the street the thought of romantic comfort by evening fires. These things still were, yet the throne of winter tottered, and every breeze brought tidings of further fortresses lost on lakes or boreal hill slopes. And not any longer as a king did winter appear in those streets, as when the city was decked with gleaming white to greet him as a conqueror, and he rode in with his glittering icicles and haughty retinue of prancing winds. But he sat there with a little wind at the corner of the street, like some old blind beggar with his hungry dog. And as to some old blind beggar death approaches, and the alert ears of the sightless man prophetically hear his far-off footfall, so there came suddenly to Winter's ears the sound, from some neighboring garden, of Spring approaching as she walked on daisies. And Spring approaching looked at huddled inglorious Winter. "Begone," said Spring. "There is nothing for you here," said Winter to her. Nevertheless he drew about him his gray and battered cloak, and rose and called to his little bitter wind, and up a side street that led northward strode away. Pieces of paper and tall clouds of dust went with him as far as the city's outer gate. He turned then and called to Spring. "You can do nothing in this city," he said. Then he marched homeward, over plains and sea, and heard his old winds howling as he marched. The ice broke up behind him and foundered like navies. To left and to right of him flew the flocks of the sea-birds, and far below him the geese's triumphant cry went like a clarion. Greater and greater grew his stature as he went northwards, and ever more kingly his mien. Now he took baronies at a stride, and now counties, and came again to the snow-white frozen lands, where the wolves came out to meet him, and draping himself anew with old grey clouds, strode through the gates of his invincible home, two old ice barriers swinging on pillars of ice that had never known the sun. So the town was left to Spring, and she peered about to see what she could do with it. Presently she saw a dejected dog coming prowling down the road, so she sang to him, and he gamboled. I saw him next day strutting by with something of an air. Where there were trees she went to them and whispered, and they sang the arboreal song that only trees can hear, and the green buds came peeping out as stars while yet it is twilight, secretly one by one. She went to the gardens and awakened from dreaming the warm maternal earth. In little patches bare and desolate she called up like a flame the golden crocus, or its purple brother like an emperor's ghost. She gladdened the graceless backs of untidy houses. Here with a weed, there with a little grass, she said to the air, "Be joyous." Children began to know that daisies blew in unfrequented corners. Buttonholes began to appear in the coats of young men. The work of spring was accomplished. End of Spring in Town.
Spring Song by Ludwig Christoph Heinrich Hulti. Translated by Alfred Baskerville. Coffee Break Collection 31. Springtime. Spring Song. The snow melts fast, May comes at last. Now shoots each spray forth blossoms gay. The warbling bird around is heard. Come, twine a wreath, and on the heath the dance prepare, ye maidens fair. Come, twine a wreath, dance on the heath. Who can foretell the tolling bell, when we with May no more shall play? Canst thou foretell the coming knell? Rejoice, rejoice, so spake his voice, who gave us birth for joy on earth. God gives us time, enjoy its prime. End of Spring Song. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The Snowdrop by Hans Christian Andersen. Coffee Break Collection 31, Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A deep snow covered the ground, for it was winter time. The air was cold, and the sharp wind blew, but in one tiny house all was snug and warm. There, under earth and snow in its bulb, lay a little flower. One day, when the rain fell, little drops trickled through the snow coverlet down into the earth and told the flower bulb about the light above. And presently a sunbeam, pointed and slender, pierced its way through the ground and tapped on the little bulb. "Come in," said the flower. "I cannot," said the sunbeam. "I'm not strong enough to lift the latch. I shall be stronger when spring comes." "When will it be spring?" asked the flower. Soon many other little sunbeams tapped on the door of the brown house, and the flower asked each of them, "When will it be spring?" But the ground was covered with snow, and every night there was ice on the water. Spring seemed so far away that the little flower sighed and said impatiently, "How long it is! How long it is! I feel quite cribbed and cramped. I must stretch out a little. I must rise up, lift the latch and look out. Then I shall say merrily to the spring, 'Good morning.'" Now the walls of the flower's house had been softened by the rain, warmed by the earth and snow, and tapped upon by the sunbeams. So when the flower within pushed and pushed against the walls, they gently gave way. Then up from under the earth shot the flower with a pale green bud on its tender stalk, and long slender leaves that curled around it for a screen. The glittering snow was very cold, but easier to push through than the solid brown earth. "Welcome, welcome," sang the evening sunbeam. "Welcome, sweet little blossom." The flower lifted its head above the snow into the world of light. The sunbeams cheered it with kisses until it unfolded itself white as the snow and decked with green stripes. "Thou art a little too early," said the wind and the weather. "We still hold sway. It is entirely too cold for thee." "Beautiful flower," sang the sunbeams, "how lovely thou art in thy white purity. Thou art the herald of spring, our first flower. Thy fair white bell shall ring the glad tidings of spring over towns and fields. The snow shall melt, the bitter wind shall be driven away. Now earth shall send forth all her lovely blossoms, and thou shalt have beautiful fellowship. Welcome. The words of the sunbeams gave deep delight to the flower. It bowed its head in gladness and humility. The weather was cold enough to freeze it to pieces, such a delicate little flower. But it was stronger than anyone knew. It was strong in its glad faith in the spring and the message of the sunbeams. And so with patient hope it stood in its white dress in the white snow, bowing its head when the snowflakes fell, and courageously lifting it again when the sunbeams scattered the clouds. "A snowdrop!" shouted the children who came running into the garden. "There it stands, so pretty, so beautiful, the first, the only one. It is Spring's messenger." "Spring's messenger," echoed from the keen morning air. End of The Snowdrop.
Excerpt from Spring in Henry David Thoreau's Walden. Coffee Break Collection 31. Springtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lori Glass, Los Angeles. LoriGlassVoiceovers.blogspot.com. Spring. A single gentle rain makes the grass many shades greener, so our prospects brighten on the influx of better thoughts. We should be blessed if we lived in the present always and took advantage of every accident that befell us, like the grass which confesses the influence of the slightest dew that falls on it, and did not spend our time in atoning for the neglect of past opportunities, which we call doing our duty. We loiter in winter while it is already spring. In a pleasant spring morning, all men's sins are forgiven. Such a day is a truce to vice. While such a sun holds out to burn, the vilest sinner may return. Through our own recovered innocence, we discern the innocence of our neighbors. You may have known your neighbor yesterday for a thief, a drunkard, or a sensualist, and merely pitied or despised him, and despaired of the world. But the sun shines bright and warm this first spring morning, recreating the world, and you meet him at some serene work, and see how his exhausted and debauched veins expand with still joy and bless the new day. Feel the spring influence with the innocence of infancy, and all his faults are forgotten. There is not only an atmosphere of goodwill about him, but even a savor of holiness groping for expression, blindly and ineffectually perhaps, like a newborn instinct, and for a short hour the south hillside echoes to no vulgar jest. You see some innocent fair shoots preparing to burst from his gnarled rind, and try another year's life, tender and fresh as the youngest plant. Even he has entered into the joy of his Lord. Why the jailer does not leave open his prison doors, why the judge does not dismiss his case, why the preacher does not dismiss his congregation, it is because they do not obey the hint which God gives them, nor accept the pardon which he freely offers to all. End of Walden, Spring. Recording by Lori Glass, Los Angeles. LoriGlassVoiceovers.blogspot.com.